Greetings, A-pushers. Remember when we last left our story? Mr. West was flashing the lights in celebration over the fact that the bottom 20% have finally gained a little bit of ground on that top 20%. They're certainly not going to catch them, but for the first time in the 1900s, that gap between the rich and the poor has started to close. Where do we see this growth going on in America at this time? In general, we see a movement south. Young men go to training camp for military service. Most often, those are in the South. Workers are moving to work in war industry centers. Some of those are in the North, but there are really big war industry centers in San Diego, in Norfolk, Virginia, in Birmingham, Alabama. And so we see real rapid growth in these areas. In general, people are moving from rural America. The rural states and sections of the country lose people, and people are going to be moving to coastal areas. It's along the Pacific coast and along the Gulf Coast where we see large gains in population. In the South and out west, we really have what we would call boom conditions. We've got most bases, most new military factories, most shipyards are either in the South or in the West. California is the state that enjoys the largest gain, gaining 2 million people in 5 years. This kind of massive migration creates problems. First off, problems in housing. There is a shortage of housing. As a result, we see really the first widespread use of trailer parks, trailer homes. And we also see a lot of boarding houses making a lot of money off of people at this time. The baby boom is going to follow hot on the heels of all of this movement. There's an increase in marriages as soldiers return from work, and most importantly, as prosperity increases, economic prosperity, there's also an increase in divorce. But the baby boom brings about its own unique problems. There's not enough daycare for all of these new children. Mothers are working. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And schools are not equipped to deal with the booming population in some areas. Some areas even experience teacher shortages. The increased demand for workers that we've been talking about leads to an increase in women being employed in by American businesses. We go from 14 million women in industry, 14 million women employed outside the home to 19 million women employed. And most importantly, it's no longer just young single women like it had been for most of the time. Additionally, there are fewer restricted industries. Industries like steel mills and shipyards that had previously been closed out to women were hiring. World War II, then, is going to be a challenge to the cult of domesticity. Now, it's a temporary challenge, but for example, women's paychecks are going to rise by 50% during the war. Moving on to African Americans. Over 1 million African Americans served in some branch of the military. Very few actually saw combat. In the Army, African American soldiers were put into segregated units with white officers. Oftentimes, these units were in charge of service. They were support units to other units, or they might have been construction units. In the Navy, African American servicemen were often relegated to cook or other menial jobs, and they couldn't become petty officers. That's the Navy equivalent of a sergeant. It's a non-commissioned officer. Philip Randolph was an African-American civilian during World War II who was a labor leader among the African-American community. And he was upset with the blatant discrimination he was seeing in many of these booming industries, and therefore threatened a march on Washington over this racial discrimination in war industries and in government employment, and demands integration of the military. FDR, hoping to avoid a major protest during the war, creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which is going to ban racial discrimination in government jobs and in war industries. So, for government jobs, they can no longer discriminate against African Americans. For a company that is fulfilling government contracts for war industry production, they cannot discriminate based on race. Now, African American employment, as a result, African American employment in the government increases by over 3 times during the war. It triples. However, there's really no significant effect from the FEPC on the private sector. The Fair Employment Practices Commission is really too weak to enforce and go out and find these examples of discrimination in the private sector. They could regulate the government, but not the private sector well enough. However, the demand for labor that we've been talking so much about is really more helpful to African Americans. Many move out of the rural South and move north and move west, oftentimes to cities, because that's where the jobs were. However, this means that race relations, African Americans and white Americans getting along, is no longer just a regional issue. It becomes a national issue. This is no longer just something that's an issue in the South. It's a national issue. And limited housing and limited recreational facilities in many cities lead to urban race riots. Some of the worst were Detroit in 1943, where 23 African Americans and 9 white Americans were killed and the National Guard had to be called in. Even in New York City and Harlem in August of 1943, the same summer, 6 African Americans were killed. All of this experience, World War II, is going to serve as a reminder of that racial inequality in America. And as a result, World War II is one of the forces behind the civil rights movement, which will start right on the heels of World War II. Let's look next at Mexican Americans briefly. Over 300,000 Mexican Americans served in the military during the war, and unlike African Americans, they're not going to be as completely segregated. Oftentimes, Mexican Americans are leaving rural areas, like many other Americans, and moving to cities. Many of them end up working in the aircraft industry and petroleum industry. But they too often suffered from discrimination. The worst example being the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles in 1943, when police officers and Marines and sailors and Army soldiers beat up a number of young Latino teenage boys wearing what were called Zoot Suits. That's what 2 of these guys are wearing in this picture here. Very baggy suits that they would wear out to clubs and things like that. And it was associated with Mexican gangs, but it was also seen as very wasteful during the war when there was rationing going on with things like cloth and cotton. Nonetheless, it's a textbook example of racial discrimination and racial violence targeting Mexican Americans during World War II.